With each passing year, it gets harder and harder to separate Jon Jones the champion from Jon Jones the criminal. So, without any further ado, let's take a dive into Jon Jones's extensive list of controversies. His first DUI charge. All crazy stories have to start somewhere, and for the young champion of the 205-pound division, 2012 was a year that definitely saw him start to carve out some mainstream success. However, an early clue to what would eventually follow came in the form of an early morning car crash that saw him wreck his Bentley Continental GT by driving into a pole. Thankfully, neither he nor the two women who accompanied him in the car were hurt, but Jones was charged with driving under the influence, was forced to install an ignition interlock on his car, and was subsequently banned from the roads for 6 months. Brawling with Daniel Cormier. The rivalry that exists between Jones and his fellow UFC legend Daniel Cormier is as heated as an interpersonal dynamic as we've ever seen within this sport. Some fighters clearly amp up their animosity for the cameras, with the aim of either attempting to rattle their opponent or simply selling a fight. But when it came to Jones and Cormier, you could just tell that their tension was very, very real. And when the time came for them to face off ahead of their original clash at UFC 182, when Jon got a little too close for comfort, DC pushed him, leading to a huge brawl that saw the entire stage come down. Eventually, the pair were separated, and thankfully no one was hurt. But even in their earliest meetings, it was clear that these two all-time greats would be intertwined for the rest of their careers. And though Jones comprehensively beat DC twice to win out the rivalry, the most memorable moment shared by these two transpired outside of the cage. First failed test. Up until this point, though he was known to most as a guy who loved to party, it had not yet trickled its way into his professional life, outside of his aforementioned arrest. However, after his pre-fight drug test prior to taking on Daniel Cormier at UFC 182, it emerged that the young champion had tested positive for cocaine. As the drug in question isn't technically a banned substance in Nevada, Jones was allowed to fight, but as you would expect, it wasn't exactly a good look. That said, UFC stepped in to fine him $25,000 and ordered him to go to rehab. Jon lasted 1 day in said rehab, and based on his own testimony, would continue taking cocaine for at least a few more years. Hit and run. Next up, we have perhaps the most infamous controversy in the career of Jon Jones, the moment that caused many people to take another look at this widely loved UFC champion. If there was a single occurrence that stood as a before and after moment in this guy's many legal issues, it was this one. New Mexico police issued information relating to a hit-and-run incident in Albuquerque on April 25, 2015. Shockingly, the man who was responsible was the one and only Jon "Bones" Jones. According to the official report, Jones crashed into 2 separate cars, one of which contained within it a pregnant woman, before exiting his vehicle and fleeing the scene. Pretty bad, right? Well, what made it even more insane was the fact that Jon actually turned around and returned to his car to pick up cash and who knows what else that he had left inside. After the knowledge of Jones's actions came to light, what could have been a simple misdemeanor was elevated to a felony, and Jon Jones's name was in the headlines on a global level. The UFC stepped in to strip him of his title, and he was handed an indefinite suspension that was later set at 18 months. And for many people, his name was forever linked to what was a truly shocking case of recklessness. UFC 200's last-minute disaster. When his long suspension had finally come to its end, and he picked up a victory, albeit an underwhelming one, in his return against Ovince St. Preux, the question became, what next? Picture the scene. Daniel Cormier had been waiting for 2 long years to get a second crack at Jon Jones, using his rival's absence from the sport to carve out his own reputation as one of the greatest fighters in the sport. Now the 205-pound champion, DC looked to be in the greatest shape of his life heading into his UFC 200 rematch, determined to get a win over the only man to have beaten him inside the octagon. Unfortunately, in the days that lead up to UFC 200's landmark event, Jones tested positive for a pair of banned substances. Tearfully taking to the stands, he attributed the substances to a pill he had been taking for erectile dysfunction. But whether you believe him or not, the fight was immediately pulled. Cormier, who was completely distraught, stayed on the card, taking a 48-hour short-notice matchup against Anderson Silva, which was indeed an underwhelming affair. But can you really blame either man? Jones was truly the one who was at fault here, losing himself yet another opportunity due to his carelessness or dishonesty, depending on how you want to look at it. Another moment ruined. When the rematch between Jones and Cormier finally happened, UFC 214 was the event, and as we all waited nervously in the hours that led up to the pay-per-view main card, it finally did appear as though Jones would actually make it to the octagon. And sure enough, as the first round was set to begin, we all sat back and let out a sigh of relief, confident in the knowledge that we were about to watch two of the greatest of all time finally settle the score. The fight itself was an excellent showcase for both guys, a back-and-forth battle that saw its momentum switch on several occasions. However, in the third round, Jones found the chink in the armor, unleashing a huge head kick to stagger, drop, and brutally finish DC. Order had been restored at 205 pounds. The champ, who had never lost his belt, had successfully returned with zero controversy. Or so it seemed. In the weeks that followed, it emerged that Jones had tested positive for the anabolic steroid turinabol, something that led to his win being declared a no contest before the title was returned to Cormier. Seriously? You could not write a more Jon Jones-like end to this section of his career. However, the anti-doping agency in question found that Jones did not intentionally ingest the substance, so make of that what you will. Uprooting UFC 232. After his 15-month suspension was served, Jones returned once again, determined to win back his 205-pound title after Cormier left the division in pursuit of heavyweight gold. This path led him back to a familiar face, his old rival Alexander Gustafsson. With the vacant light heavyweight title up for grabs, and Jones once again telling us all that he was a changed man, the MMA world were rocked to their very core by the news that Jon had once again tested positive. However, this time, according to USADA, it was nothing more than a pulsing trace of turinabol that had remained in his system from his original failed test in 2017. Even with that being the case, Las Vegas's commission refused to allow him to fight. Upon hearing this, despite all of the ticket holders who had paid for their spot at the event and their accommodation, Dana White uprooted the entire UFC 232 event on just 6 days' notice and moved it to Los Angeles. Seriously, even for Uncle Dana, that's a bit of a crazy move, don't you think? I suppose Jones just brings it out in him. 2019's Battery Charge. In 2019, in the weeks that followed his narrow win over Thiago Santos, Jones once again found himself in hot water after a waitress in a strip club he was visiting accused him of slapping her, attempting to kiss her, before putting her in a chokehold. Naturally, the MMA world were a mixture of disgust and just generally not being shocked at all. But as the latest legal issue to take its place on his extensive record, Jones, upon pleading a no contest to the charges, received a 90-day deferred sentence, one that required him to avoid drugs and alcohol, as well as the original scene of the crime in question. A bizarre lockdown arrest. In the early hours of March 26, 2020, with the city of Albuquerque, New Mexico under lockdown, Jon Jones was found in his Jeep by a nearby police officer after he had heard what sounded like a gunshot. Upon finding the UFC star in the driver's seat, a field sobriety test showed that Jones was over the legal limit. The officer in question then found a bottle of mezcal and a loaded handgun under the seat. After he was brought in, Jones was charged with aggravated DWI, negligent use of a firearm, possession of an open container, and driving with no proof of insurance. Once he pled guilty to the charge, he was sentenced to 4 days house arrest, 48 hours of community service, and 90 days of outpatient therapy. A new low? And finally, we come to the most recent entry on our list, a moment that made most fans of the sport truly question everything. Just prior to this latest issue, Jones was making the headlines for all the right reasons. A move to heavyweight for 2022 saw him looking increasingly more suitable for the weight class, and upon receiving his induction to the UFC Hall of Fame for his legendary showdown with Alexander Gustafsson, he seemed to be in genuinely good spirits. To put it simply, all seemed to be well in the world of Jon Jones. Unfortunately, the very same night of the UFC Hall of Fame show, this troubled former champion was involved in one of his most disturbing controversies to date. After receiving a call from his hotel that reportedly came from his daughter, Nevada officers detained Jon as he attempted to leave the room. When they brought him back to the hotel room, he was questioned, along with his partner, who had small amounts of blood on her face and clothing, which she attributed to chapped lips. Unconvinced, they brought Jones in for questioning, but not before he threatened the officers and repeatedly smashed his head against the patrol vehicle. He was eventually charged with 1 count of domestic battery, a misdemeanor, and tampering with a police vehicle. His bail was set at $16,000 and he was released shortly after. For many fans, this was the last straw, and though his cheerful social media posts would suggest that he's taking this lightly, only time will tell just how much improvement this guy can realistically make.